I was actually I was born in a thatched cottage in the south of England in a place called Thruxton Down. I mean, there's a big racecourse there now. I don't remember too much about that early life, but from the age of 2, I moved with my family to the south of the New Forest. It was only about half a mile from the south coast, and my father and like his father before them, they were all in the Royal Navy, and they wanted me to go into the Royal Navy as well. My brother went into the Royal Navy. It was a proper Royal Navy family. So my father had been in the Royal Navy, he came out, and then he wanted to get into sort of farm work. So they had moved to an estate in the south of England, which is where I grew up, in the New Forest. And it was the Rothschilds' estate. They had a tied cottage, and which was a cottage that you got for free if you worked on the estate. It was a mixed farm, and my father did everything from milking the cows to doing sort of hay baling, everything. There was a lot of different work that we did on that farm. So never had a television. Sort of grew up with a TV, and I remember the neighbors getting a TV, and I was able to go next door and watch this little black and white sort of TV set, which was showing things like William Tell, Robin Hood. And I remember seeing my first film I probably watched on that television. I think that was Tom Sawyer, which I absolutely loved, and I kind of modeled myself on sort of Tom Sawyer. I would sort of go out and sort of hike around all the sort of woodland. Where our cottage was, it was we had a fairly large garden. We had chickens and that kind of thing. And you go to the back of the garden, and then you look out across a field, and there was just woodland everywhere around. So it was right in the middle of the country. And it was a great place to sort of go exploring and discovering stuff. And my parents were really anxious that I follow in the steps of my father and my brother. So I was in the Sea Scouts, and which was kind of to prime me for sort of going into the Royal Navy. And I quite enjoyed the Cubs and the Scouts, but it was on a visit to see my brother one time. He was in a naval base at Dartmouth. And I remember going down there and just seeing him marching around this parade ground with all of the other recruits at the base. And I was thinking, really, I don't think this is for me, this sort of life. And anyway, so I always had this in the back of my mind, and it was the thing that I first really got into. I was good at drawing, and I liked art. And the first film that my mother took me to see, I think it was around 1961, and she took me to see 101 Dalmatians, the Disney film. And it just, it was the first film that I saw in a cinema. And just seeing all that color, seeing it on that scale, it just blew me away. And I remember weeks and weeks after that, I was just drawing Dalmatians. And then I remember sort of going to see the Jungle Book. I loved all those early Disney animations. And I would spend all of the next weeks, after seeing those movies, I would just be drawing Baloo the bear or Bagheera or whoever. And I just did hundreds of drawings. And so when I went to secondary school, which I suppose is the equivalent of your high school here, one of the things that I really got into was the art classes. And I decided to, drop one of the language courses so that I could do more art. And so it was just great to, have all that time actually at school and to realize that maybe I could make a career out of this through art. Of course, my family at the time was saying, "Well, you can still join the Royal Navy, and you can still do art in the Royal Navy." And I thought, really? I'm not so sure about that. So that wasn't something that I thought was a reality. And so I decided that I wanted to go to art school. So I applied to art school, and I remember getting into Winchester School of Art. And when I went to Winchester, that was the first time that I'd moved away from home, where I was living somewhere else. And so that experience of being away from my parents, just totally looking after myself, and just spending that time with all of these new friends that I met in the school was quite a revelation. And so I started off, it was every art school, I think, depending on who the tutors are, those tutors are always going to sort of push the students a little bit in the direction of the art that they do. And I remember those tutors at that school were into abstract expressionism, which I wasn't. I got into systems art that was sort of based on geometry. I did a lot of things where I would sometimes just throwing a dice, writing numbers down, and then arranging sort of rectangles that corresponded to those numbers, and creating patterns. And from those early projects with systems, I moved on to using sort of colors, where the colors were derived from the systems. And then from the flat art, I got into doing reliefs. And so I made these constructions, which looked totally gray on the front, but on the underneath surfaces, they were inverted, triangular pieces where underneath I'd had prime colors like reds and blues and yellows. And and I would shine light into these constructions, so they reflected onto these inverted sort of pyramids, so that I would get mixtures of colors. And one of the things that really surprised me was the way the color, when it mixed together as light, was totally different from the way it mixed together when it was pigments. And that was another revelation. And I had no idea that happened. But I wanted to really get into color and to really explore color. So I would spend maybe, the best part of a week, taking all the reds and mixing up what was the most prime red, what was the most prime yellow, and what was the most prime blue. When I'd got those colors, I mixed up enough of them, I would paint a pretty large canvas, about 6 feet by 5 feet, and I would have my prime blue, my prime yellow, and my prime red. And then I would take it out into a park, and then I sort of played with those canvases to get them. I would space them out so that they would look as if they were together in my sort of camera. And I wanted to place them so that I could get the same intensity of sort of color. So the blue, obviously, was the one that was closest to the camera. And then came the red. And then what really knocked me out was when I placed the yellow. The yellow was like 100 yards away. It was almost right over the other side of the field before I got that same intensity of color. And that taught me a really great lesson moving forward. It also really trained my eye when I was looking at color. I could walk down the street, I could look at a door, and I'd decide exactly what green that was. It was a little bit blue, or whether it was heading towards a sort of yellow. So it was a great way of sort of training my eye to color. And I think that really sort of paid off for sort of later on when I got into sort of filmmaking, which was still a long way away. After working at Winchester School of Art, I decided to do a diploma in art and design, and so I applied to Bristol College of Art. So I managed to get a place there, and there was an American tutor there who I got on really well with, and he was really into sort of using sort of color in interesting ways. His name was Hassel Smith, actually, and he was from California, and that was something that he had a great influence on me, I guess. And I still carried on with some of that geometric sort of painting that I started off in sort of Winchester. And during the time, it was during my time at Bristol that I bought a camera, and I discovered that they had a darkroom in the art school. So I started to get into sort of photography, mainly taking black and white photographs and then processing those photographs in the darkroom in the art school. And that was a really great time because I really got into the photography, and after learning how to use the darkroom properly, how to print photographs, I moved on to sort of color stuff, taking slides, and I was doing slideshows for my sort of friends and art school mates. It was probably the thing that, at that time I had no idea, that I might end up working in the film industry. And I think it was because I always thought the film industry was something other people did, and it was just something that I didn't do myself and probably would never do. And I never really thought about it because I always thought that I would just carry on with my art. And I remember applying to a couple of post colleges to do, post course for another sort of couple of years. And I didn't get accepted anywhere because I think my art had got so boring to other people. It was fascinating and interesting to me still, but I think because it became so about sort of color, it was so about systems. Some of my paintings were like giant jigsaw puzzles, shaped canvases that fitted together like jigsaw puzzles. And it was all about how those sort of colors fitted together. I was doing a lot of, geometric work that were just fine lines of color, so I could see the way when you stood back, those lines of color just mixed together at a certain distance. And they set up certain kind of tensions. So although it was fascinating to me, it was just really dull to other people. So my 3 years doing a diploma in art and design I was there from the age of 21 to 24. I spent in Bristol studying art, studying art theory as well. So there were artists. One of the artists that really had an effect on me was an artist called Louis Tomasello. And he had, one of his, I don't know whether you call it a painting, it was halfway between a painting and a construction. I suppose it would be a relief, really. He'd made a structure of cubes. And on top of the cubes, they were grey facing you, but all the sides of the cubes were painted with color that you couldn't quite see, but you could see the reflections of the color that sort of came when the light hit it. And when the light hit it at different times of the day, it had a different intensity. And so that artist, there was another artist called Yakov Agam who also did these relief paintings that they changed as you walked by them. So I was fascinated by that. I was fascinated by the Impressionists, like Monet in particular. The Impressionists never used black, and so or even the very dark shades were all comprised of different sort of colors in the way they used their pointillism, or the way Monet used sort of colors, multiple colors to make an overall sort of different sort of tonal range of sort of color. So all that thing really, really fascinated me. And so even after art school, I'd sort of carried on doing paintings. And they obviously became a much smaller scale when I didn't have a big studio space. So I started working on much smaller size. And I also got much more into my photography too. Now, there was a couple of things that happened. I remember I'd got into a relationship with a woman while I was at the art school. And we were living together after we'd left art school. And then she decided with a friend to go and travel in the United States. And I think they started off in Canada, and then she traveled through the United States. And I think she ended up in Mexico, in Mazatlan, where she met a Mexican hairdresser, and she ended up checking out with this guy. And so I was getting all these letters from her during this time. It was like one of those relationships where I'd never split up with this person. And we probably should have split up, but it was always like she was going to go traveling, and then she was going to come back, and we would carry on our relationship. So there was a realization that that was never going to happen. So I thought, well, I may as well just go traveling myself. So I didn't get into these art schools I applied for. So I got into my photography. So I thought I'm just going to take my camera and I'm going to travel around sort of Canada and the United States. So at the age of 25, I think on June the 12th, 1977, I'd never flown on an aircraft before, but I got on this plane and flew to Toronto in Canada. I went to Toronto because I knew some people there, and so I had a place to stay when I got there. And it was at the time, 1977, in June of that year, God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols was in the top 10. I took a whole bunch of punk singles, including a lot of the Sex Pistols, God Save the Queen, and a picture cover. So I was able to sort of hand out, the people that I stayed with, they loved punk. And there was a punk scene, bit different to what was happening in the UK, but there was this amazing punk scene sort of going on in Toronto. And they had a club called the Crash and Burn. And there were bands like the Lost Boys that sort of turned up there. I saw some really great sort of punk bands. And one of the people that I stayed with was in a punk band as well. So anyway, I was able to pay my rent with these punk singles that I took with me. And I thought Toronto was a really, fantastic city. And I think it's still one of the great cities, on the planet, and one of the best that I've traveled to, that I've visited. I had a great time discovering Toronto, and then it got to the point where I thought, well, I've got to start traveling. So I hitchhiked from Toronto to, I think it was Sault Ste. Marie, crossed over into the United States. I remember my first night in the United States. I hadn't got that far. I'd only got a few miles, and I got dropped off at night in a sort of swampy area of Michigan, UP. I was beset upon by mosquitoes, and God knows what. That was a terrible night. But the next night, I found some really good people in a little place down the road, and sort of hung out with them for a while. But what we'd been told about was that the most fantastic place to go in the United States was apparently San Francisco. It was the city of love, and so I wanted to get to San Francisco. So I ended up hitchhiking and having some pretty amazing experiences, hitchhiking across the United States and going to San Francisco. And I met some really great, all the people, I'd had a few addresses in San Francisco, but it's probably one of the most transient cities on the planet. And so none of those people were there any longer, but I met a few people during the day. and got on well with them, and they invited me back to stay at their place. So I met some really good friends at that time in San Francisco. I had a place to stay. I had it was a great scene. It was a great art scene. And I remember I was really into my art still. And I remember going down to the art museum on Van Ness and going to see, I think it was an exhibition of Argentine drawings. And I remember meeting this woman there who sort of talked to me about, she had this, fantastic place, hung out with these great people. They had a place north of San Francisco. And anyway, cut a long story short, I ended up about 130 miles north of San Francisco that night, because I was kind of open to a lot of things. And it was really strange because, one of the reasons I was going with this woman was I thought I'd probably get to sleep with her, but how wrong was I? It's because when we got there, all the men were separated and asked to sleep on the floor of this hut. The women were in another place. And I thought, this is really strange. And so when I got up the next morning, people were singing songs. It was really odd, this place. And they were talking about, it was like people doing almost these sermons, and they were talking about the Unification Church. And I thought, what is this? It was like, while I was in San Francisco, I just read Helter Skelter, which was about the Manson gang. And I thought, oh my God, am I in some weird cult or something? And I just found it really, really strange. Everyone was sort of holding hands, and the big thing was, you got to share your story of your life with people. And when people were sharing their story, it all turned out they were kind of sort of washed up gamblers or people who had a terrible time and ended up with this cult. And who they were, I had no idea. But anyway, I started to get pretty worried. And I remember one evening they were going to go off for singing in the woods, and I thought, well, maybe I might be the sacrifice or something. And so I decided we were all, trudging up this trail into the darkness, and I thought, I'm going to get out of here. And I started running back down the trail. The woman that I'd first gone with kept on sort of calling out my name, and I thought, there's no way I'm stopping. And I sort of ran through all the huts, and I ran out by the gate. There was a guy on the gate, and he said, "Oh, where are you going?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just going back to San Francisco to get some of my belongings, because I came here not even with my toothbrush." So anyway, he let me go out of the gate, and then I got out onto the highway, and it was dark, it was night, and I was hitchhiking. And then this van sort of stops, and I get in, and he says, "Well, where have you been?" And I said, "Well, you won't believe this, but I've been with some really strange people, some kind of commune down the road." And he said, "What, you've been with the Moonies?" And I said, "Who are the Moonies?" And then I got to learn about who the Moonies were. And anyway, this guy was a really cool character. He lived on a ranch with some sort of folks, and so yeah, they all smoked marijuana and took cocaine and that stuff. So I was kind of getting back to somewhere close to normality. So that was a really interesting experience, and I did a lot more traveling, around the States after that. And people say, "Oh, well, that's something that you wouldn't do now. There's probably too many psychos out there." But I don't know. There were psychos out there, back in 1977 and 1978. There's plenty of psychos to go around. So, and I met some pretty strange people, and I just squeaked through a lot of dangerous situations. So I can certainly advise on, hitchhiking in Mexico. Don't do it. I think I believe we all have our guardian angels who kind of look after us. So sometimes I remember there would be a car would would stop. They would be going to where I wanted to go. They looked like a completely straight person, but there's some alarm signal that's going off in your head saying, don't get in this car. And you have to sort of pay attention to those signals. So, and I think that was, one of the reasons I survived that sort of whole thing. But there was one time, so I ended up, eventually I got back to New York and spent 3 months in New York. Loved the art scene in New York City, loved New York City. I thought it was a really sort of cool place. And I found that the art that was going on the East Coast seemed to be far more interesting than what was going on the West Coast. So I sort of hung out in New York for quite a while and ended up hitchhiking sort of down the East Coast, and I ended up in New Orleans. There I got a flight to Guatemala, and Guatemala is a really beautiful place. And then I was traveling through Mexico. In Mexico, I was really interested in all the Aztec Mayan ruins. So I remember going to sort of Palenque, and that was a really, really great experience, sort of hanging out in Palenque with all the sort of hippies, but finding out about a culture that was so alien and so sort of different to anything that I'd sort of come across before. Really fascinating. And I loved all the Mexican people that I met. I thought very friendly, very hospitable. And so traveling in Mexico was great. What inspired me in, well, both Mexico and in Guatemala was the way they use color, even in what they wore. For instance, in Guatemala, each village would have their own traditional sort of clothes, and you'd see people halfway up a volcano that was wearing this traditional clothes, and they would have these knee length sort of pants which were embroidered with quetzal birds. Amazing sort of colors, and I thought it was great the way each village would have its own sort of particular sort of style of clothes. And when you were up in the more mountainous villages, they were wearing much warmer clothes made out of wool, but still really sort of interesting sort of designs. And always you'd find, the art that was quite often for sale was really fascinating, and I just loved all the colors and the style of that art. It really inspired me. And while I was the same thing, when I was in Mexico, and it wasn't just the people, it wasn't just the clothes, the handicrafts, everything, but there was just the nature there. And I suppose while I was in Palenque, I'd spent a lot of time sort of hanging out by these Mayan ruins, and there were a lot of psilocybin mushrooms around, and you could buy them off of the locals. And I was probably eating psilocybin mushrooms pretty much every day, and they would accentuate all the sort of colors. And there are red cardinals that are so red that they would land on a twig in front of you, and the jungle around them was so green that the color would literally be vibrating. There were snakes that were red and black bands, dragonflies with the most iridescent sort of colors. And I remember I couldn't believe my eyes with some of these amazing sights that I was seeing on a daily basis. So anyway, there was one day where I really wanted to go out and find my own mushrooms. So I decided I knew where the mushroom fields were. So I started sort of walking down, and there was a river that it meandered around, and so you kept on having to ford the river. And I remember sitting down on the riverbank, and I watched this Mexican woman with a black umbrella. She was walking towards me forded across the river. And she got to my side of the river and she said, "¿Quieres hongos? Do you want some mushrooms?" So I thought, well, I may not find any mushrooms, so maybe it's a good idea that I buy some off of her. So I bought some of these amazing looking mushrooms off her, and I thought I'll eat 7 of them. And so I ate 7 of these mushrooms, and then I carried on sort of hiking. And I saw some amazing sights. And, you know, people say it's kind of magic things happen when you eat psilocybin mushrooms. And I remember hearing the cry of a bird, and I just stopped on the track, walked into the field, bent down, parted the grass, and there was a mushroom. And so I picked the mushroom and I ate it. And that's when the effect of the psilocybin really started to sort of come on me. And some of the sights that I saw after that and some of the colors of the insects and the birds was just quite amazing. And I reached this field where the grass was really short on it. It was a really bright green, looked incredibly bright green. And there were all these blackened tree trunks that either they'd been struck by lightning, I don't know, but it was amazing. This bright green hill and these tree trunks that were blackened tree trunks as if struck by lightning. And I remember sort of going over there, and there were these humpback white cattle that were majestically walking around. I thought, God, I've got to get a picture of this place. It looks incredible. And I was looking through my camera. I couldn't get everything in the lens. And then I looked down at one of my legs, and I thought, oh, I must have brushed up against some red lichen or something. All of my leg was red. And then I tried to get this picture. Couldn't get the picture. And I looked down at my red leg, and the red had just spread. And I suddenly realized it was ants. It was red ants, and they were just streaming up me. My first reaction is to kind of take my hand and try and sort of push them down my leg. Very bad idea. It's like having an electric shock in your hand. And then all the ants were, running up my sleeve. So I thought, oh, God, don't let them get on your face. Get your shirt off. And I was running down. I just dropped everything, headed for the river. And I remember plunging into the really dirty, slow part of this river as I was ripping off all my clothes to try and stop the ants getting on my face. And once I was in the water, I was able to sort of get them off. I was able to get them off my skin, but I had to literally beat them out of my clothes. And anyway, that was quite something. Well, and the reason why I'm telling you this story is I actually got quite ill from this, and I don't know whether it's from the river, whether it's from the ants, I don't know. I got something really bad, a virus that was living in my bloodstream. And you get these kind of volcano-like lumps on your wrists, and this pus comes out of these volcano lumps. It's like the excretion of the virus, I don't know. Anyway, I was in a bad way. I tried to cure it with penicillin, herbal remedies that they told me about in these markets. And I was continuing to travel through Mexico, got to Mexico City, and by then my leg was really swelling up. I was in a really bad way. And so I thought, oh, let's go to Mazatlan, and maybe I could sort of meet up with my ex in sort of Mazatlan, but she might know some people that can help me. So I got a bus to Mazatlan, and I sort of turned up there, and I did meet up with my ex-girlfriend there. And they let me into the house and introduced me to some student doctors that they knew who were able to take care of me. But it took weeks to get rid of this virus because my whole leg had swollen up. My foot was almost disappearing. I was in a really bad way. So it took a long time to recover from that. And during my recovery, I decided I would stay on this beach because it wasn't really good staying in their house. So I went out with my hammock, and I was staying on this beach. And there's a beach in Mazatlan. You get a ferry to it, and there's just a few grass-roofed palapas, and just a beach that goes on for miles and miles and miles, and just a coconut grove. And on this beach, there's crabs that live all the way up the beach. And I'm telling you this story because there was one point where the crabs that were nearest to the village just lived in holes in the sand. The crabs would sort of come out in the afternoon, and they would usually go down and just paddle in the sea, and then they would come back and they'd get in their holes. But they left these trails of what looked like writing in the sand. It looked like calligraphy. And I remember taking, or trying to take a picture of this calligraphy in the sand with all these amazing strata of all these bands that the wind had made in the sand. I thought it was a really cool picture, and then the wind started blowing, and I was just looking through my camera, and I just kept looking through the camera until the wind had come and it had just blown away all of the crab tracks. And at that point, I thought, God, I wish I had a movie camera, and I could have got that and what I saw just looking through the camera. And it was probably that one single moment that I decided I really need to get into moving pictures. And after that stay in Mexico, I went back into the States, and I sort of carried on hitchhiking through the States. Got to San Francisco, and I met this artist in San Francisco. And I actually met up with my old art school teacher there, Hassel Smith, as well. He was still lecturing at one of the art schools there. So I went to see him, and he introduced me to this guy who did experimental films in Super 8. And he did what I can only describe as cubism, but moving cubism on Super 8 film. It's where he would photograph something from multiple angles, and it was just all moving about, but you'd see all these multiple angles of the same object. And it was just fascinating. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've really got to get into sort of doing this stuff. And that's one of the things I did that, months later after I got back to the UK. I was traveling for 18 months. But after those 18 months, and when I finally sort of returned to the UK, I bought myself a Super 8 camera. And I started to make my own films. I would go out, buy a cassette, 3 minutes of Super 8 film. I would go to a part of the city and just film all the life that happened in that part of the city, send off the film, get it back. And the editing equipment was really cheap at that time. So it was really easy for me to sort of buy the Super 8 equipment in order to edit the films so that I could do my own editing, and then I have a complete little film that by reconstructing sort of 3 minutes from a Super 8 cassette. And I kept on doing that, and then I had a whole bunch of films that I was able to apply to the film school in Bristol, and I sort of got into doing a 1 year sort of crash course. It was called the RFT, Radio, Film, and Television. So we did radio shows, TV, and we made documentary and fiction films. It was a really, really, really great time for me. And it was great that I spent so much time, and I would recommend anyone who's getting into film, teach yourself as much as you can. There's always going to be other people that you can sort of teach you about film, but as much as you can teach yourself by, reading about it, but doing it, filming, editing, cutting stuff together, you're going to be a better filmmaker by taking that route, I think. So by the time that was 19, I got back to Bristol at the end of 1978. So I really wanted to get into my photography when I got back to Bristol. So I joined a film co-op because I wanted to get into sort of doing sort of film. And I didn't really know how to do it because I knew that it was something that was kind of expensive to do, and it was discovering that I could work on Super 8 really cheaply. That's the reason why I got into working in Super 8. It was great to, be part of the film co-op and to be, put on sort of film nights, watch different movies. And that's another thing, is just watching movies is a great way to sort of learn about, filmmaking. Yeah, I think one of the films, but it was much earlier. It was when I was a kid, and one of the few times when my father actually got me to the cinema on time. We used to live right out in the country, so to get to our local cinema, you'd have to cycle 5 miles, and my father never got it right. We always arrived 10 minutes late for the movie, so all the first films that I saw, apart from the one when my mother took me, I always had to stay and see the first part of the film on the second showing of the film. It happened every time. And so anyway, I didn't forgive him for that, but he did. There was a few films where we did get there, from the beginning. And there's two films that I saw in my local cinema that just blew me away. One of them is still my sort of favorite movie, and it's Lawrence of Arabia by David Lean. It's one of those sort of epic films that is probably would be really difficult to make, in today's world. But that film, just in terms of what it was about, the beauty of the cinematography, the locations, the fact that it was this brilliant adventure, and it was an amazing experience that this one man had, and what happened to him during his life. And I thought the way that had been committed to celluloid was one of the films that still today, when I watch it, it still blows me away. There was that film, and then 2001, A Space Odyssey. That was another film that absolutely sort of blew me away. And I still go back to that time, and I can remember watching those movies for the very first time, when they came out on the big screen. The films later, after I sort of returned to sort of Bristol after sort of traveling in the States, the films that really influenced me at that time were, I remember seeing Jaws, which I suppose really was the first big summer blockbuster. That film was another one that I couldn't believe. Yeah, I came out of the cinema and I thought, God, that's probably one of the best movies I've ever seen, but I didn't know why it was so good. Yeah, so after the course I did in radio, film, and television, I was looking to get straight into sort of film, and I was looking around at what people were doing independently around Bristol. There was some really interesting sort of filmmaking going on. There was a lot of people doing stuff with filming bands, and that was people had a little bit of money to do stuff, and so if there was something that you could do on a small budget, and I was able to do stuff working in 16 millimeter and working in sort of Super 8. And it was like experimental, and it was edgy enough that people were really into that. And I was also able to, I after leaving the radio, film, and television course, I worked there for a while, and I was able to go in after hours. Like a band would sort of come to me and say, "Hey, can you do some music video?" And so I said, "Sure." And I could film some stuff, or maybe we can sort of sneak into the college. And I know how to set up the TV studio, and we can do some stuff in the TV studio. And I knew how to mess around and get some kind of solarized effects on the TV cameras and that sort of thing. So sometimes I would sort of go in and do videos for bands in the college TV studio. And I remember one night, the head of the college happened to walk in, and I thought, oh my God, now I've really blown it. And but he was actually impressed that somebody was coming in and using the kit. So that was great. I thought, wow, maybe I can just sort of carry on doing this. So there were lots of opportunities like that, and there was, I happened to meet people just doing stuff, in Bristol. They'd have a little bit of money to do stuff, and they were happy with whatever they could get, because they weren't going to have to shell out thousands of pounds. So that was a great experience, just working on a lot of little independent movies. And I managed to get some money to do a little film that was, I got some money from the universities had different societies. And I managed to get some money from some of these societies to make a little 30-minute sort of fiction sort of film. That one of the tutors who's at the radio, film, and television sort of course had written. So they were able to make a little short film there. So there were a number of opportunities to, make short films, short documentaries. So, and that kept me busy for a while. And then I got a job with Rolls-Royce. I got offered a job with Rolls-Royce, the aero engine company, for their film unit. And they had to extensively vet me, but when they sort of discovered that I suppose a lot of my family had been, in the Royal Navy, they thought I must be okay. So they had no idea that I was the left-wing sort of hippie that I actually was. So I ended up working for Rolls-Royce for about 2.5 years, which was a lot of filming aircraft, filming helicopters, filming the build of aero engines. So some of the films were marketing films. Some of them were about how they audited engine parts and all that kind of thing. It was pretty fascinating, and it was a good time. I traveled to sort of Spain and to the US to make films for sort of Rolls-Royce, and it was a really good experience. Yeah, it's very true. Filming helicopters, filming from helicopters as well. It was a really good educational experience. It's very difficult to, follow a sort of jet plane, just filming a jet plane sort of taking off. It takes a lot of sort of practice to sort of get that right. And then you don't realize how powerful some of these machines. There was one time when I had to get the afterburn of a jet sort of taking off. And so I was right behind this jet, and I knew there was going to be some force coming from it. The camera and everything had to be chained down to the ground. But when that jet took off, it almost sort of blew me over. I had no idea of what was going to happen. So it was, both educational, character forming as well. I'd never flown in a helicopter before. So my first helicopter ride was from JFK Airport into Manhattan, and that was something else. So Rolls-Royce was just a great experience. Because one of the good things is when you work for a sort of big company, Rolls-Royce, you're always using different cameras, different film cameras. And it was at the time when video was just coming in. And so that was really different, because never done anything on a sort of digital sort of camera before. So that was really sort of fascinating to sort of find out about, shooting on video. It was a completely different game from shooting on film. And the thing there was, at least you had a monitor that you could see, exactly what you were going to get. I mean, at that time, though, the quality of the video, wasn't great. So you're always sort of better off sort of working on film. So I kind of, made me avoid video in the future. So I always sort of continued working on film whenever I could, because I knew that I was going to get a better quality. And there was always something about the grain of the film that made it real somehow, which is what I really liked about it. So I started to do more. After sort of Rolls-Royce, I was doing a bit of assistant sort of camera work. And that got me into learning about a lot more sort of cameras. And then one of the local studios that were working in animation asked me whether I'd used a 35 millimeter Mitchell before, which I never had. And so, of course, I said yes. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that camera. So they offered me this commercial to do on a Mitchell, an S35, I think it was. And so I went home, got out my American cinematographer manual, sort of looked out how to lace up a Mitchell, went in the next day to the studio, looking like I totally knew. I'd been using this camera for years. And so I laced it up. Actually, when I laced it up, I thought, God, it's kind of almost easier than 16 millimeter. This is great. So, and then I kind of made myself, I'd kind of transferred from being an assistant camera, sort of working on 16 millimeter, to working in 35 millimeter as a DP overnight. I mean, just by saying you can. And I think I was already doing pretty good lighting, so I just got accepted in my new role. That's how it happened. Yeah, so during the latter part of the 80s, and I'd met some people, or there was a guy that moved into the house I was living in who was a musician. And I got together with him, and we started writing songs together. And then we decided, oh, why don't we get a band together? So we got a band together. We started, getting gigs. We did some gigs around sort of Bristol. And because I was, into the sort of filmmaking, we started making, films that, for our music as well. And that was really, really good fun. And I did that in the latter part of the 80s. And then coming up to the 90s, there was a company in Bristol that were called the Bolex Brothers. And they'd been doing some pretty sort of squinky sort of animated films in stop frame animation. I'd done some experimental stuff, pixelating. After anyone who uses a Super 8 camera, eventually they discover the stop frame button. And once I discovered the stop frame button, I was doing pixelation of landscape, animating humans. So anyway, one of the things that the Bolex brothers were really interested in was pixelation, like animating people. I think pixelation was a term that was derived by Norman McLaren. It was a guy who came from the Glasgow School of Art. He ended up working for the Canadian Film Board and made some amazing animated films for them. His term of pixelation, he derived from, he would shoot something live action and then he would cut the film up, but he'd cut loads of frames out so that it would have this, quite a sort of jerky look to it, but quite a brilliant look. And he called that pixelation. So animating with people sort of became sort of pixelation. It was one of the things that I did quite a lot, especially on sort of Super 8 and on 16 millimeter. And it was something that this company called the Bolex Brothers, they were really into it. And in around about 1990, 91, they decided they were going to make a feature film using this technique. And so I joined them in making a film. It was all on 16 millimeter. and it was about an hour long, and it was called The Secret Adventures of Tom Thumb. And this was a film using both humans and animated puppets. So the puppets, which were just about sort of so high, 6 inches, 7 inches high. So the Tom Thumb character was this diminutive character who lived in a world of giants, who were the human people in it. So I joined that project doing set dressing, lighting, camera. We did a bit of everything. There wasn't, like today, everyone's sort of pigeonholed, but you could do everything in that company, and there were no divisions. And I thought it was a great way of working in one way. And for me to be able to do lighting, camera, and then to just move into an animator role, I thought was great. I really loved, I'd been doing a bit of animation prior to that, but to be able to get into it on a much sort of larger scale was really great. So both animating the puppets and appearing in the film, I had 2 parts in the film, and so I was able to animate myself as well as animating the puppets, and that was a really great experience. At that time, there was no post work, so everything had to be in camera. So when you wanted to use a special effect, like at one point, Tom Thumb is being electrocuted. He's in this kind of vivisection unit of this weird sort of building somewhere, and we had to have this electric effect. So the only time to do an in-camera effect at that time was to roll the film back and to re-expose it with your electric effect. That was usually done by having a time exposure and moving a light bulb through with a color on it through the frame. And so that's how we did any sort of special effects in the film, is just by rewinding the film and re-exposing. So everything in that film is what was shot in camera. And today I can't think of anything. There's probably there's very few shots in the stop frame films that I work on today that don't go through some kind of post process or aren't shot on a green screen. I think that's probably the last sort of feature that I worked on that didn't have any post process to it whatsoever, and everything had to be done in camera. And I think, and at the time, because Aardman Animations, so I'd never done any work for Aardman Animations, but I was working at another studio. It's called Elm Road. Those were the guys that I told how I was brilliant at using 35mm cameras. And so Aardman's heard that I was really good with 35mm cameras, and they had a whole bunch of 35mm cameras that they'd bought from the United States. I think some of those 35mm cameras had been used on the I Love Lucy show. Anyway, they had a bunch of these cameras, and they wanted someone to come in and check them out and check how technically good they were. They didn't have any light leaks in them, anything like that. And so I got asked to go in and check out some of their Mitchell cameras. So I went into Aardman and I was doing all these tests on their cameras. And while I was there, 3 producers that were in Aardman's who kind of heard about me sort of came into where I was doing these tests on the camera. And I think I was offered 3 different jobs on that one day that I was in Aardman's. And so in a few weeks after that, I did my first commercial for Aardman's. And the first commercial I did for Aardman's, I got some kind of award for the cinematography. And then after that, I just got more and more work for them, ended up working on the Wallace and Gromit films. The first Wallace and Gromit film I worked on was A Close Shave. Nick Park was just a really great sort of director to sort of work with. I got on really well with him. And I think that's probably, one of the reasons I was asked to work on when they did a deal with DreamWorks and they were going to make Chicken Run. I got asked to sort of work on that. Yeah. One of the things, working with Nick Park, working at Aardman. One of the great things was each commercial that you did almost had a kind of style, a slightly different style to it. Wallace and Gromit had already got a style to it, and you kind of had to stick to the rules a little bit. But one of the things that was great is that Nick Park was always open to maybe, combining shots. And sometimes I was able to show him how we could maybe combine 3 shots together and make it all into a single camera move. And it was great that he was really open to sort of stuff like that. And so, there was room, for sort of creativity there. There was room in the lighting as well. Certain things had been set up, but you could introduce new sort of colors. It wasn't really, though, until I worked on sort of Chicken Run, where I was able to break away from the kind of formula, if you like, for Wallace and Gromit and start to introduce new colors. There was always a certain color that they used for the sort of moonlight, and I wanted to introduce new colors of blue, different blues that would say when I wanted a scene to have more drama, I could use the slate blue, or I could use different blues that gave the scenes a whole different feel. And it wasn't really until sort of Chicken Run that I was really able to do that and was really able to sort of branch out and experiment using sort of different colors and to discover how those colors could really imbue a scene with a certain emotional feel. So in between the features, there's always a sort of period where there isn't much going on. So you'd search around for work, and I remember one time someone came to me and they said, this guy Joe Wobble, he was the bass player with Pill. He's looking for someone to make a video for him, and he didn't have much money. It was only he had £3,000, and he wanted to, which he'd been given to make a promotional film for an album that he'd done called Heaven and Earth. So anyway, he wasn't too bothered about using that money for a promotional film for Heaven and Earth. He'd been working on some other projects, and one of them was based on the poetry of William Blake, and it was the Songs of Innocence is what he really wanted to make. So anyway, I got introduced to Jar Wobble, and just got on really well with him because we both loved Apocalypse Now. I don't know why we ended up talking about Apocalypse Now, but it was one of his favorite movies. It was one of my favorite movies, and so he said, look, Frank, I've got, there's a bunch of films. You could choose, what you want to do. And so I thought, there's going to be one of these that he really wants to do. And it sounded to me that he really wanted to do William Blake. So I ended up taking his £3,000, and I spent a summer, no time limit on it, said, you can take as long as you need. And so I made this movie. It was a mixture of sort of pixelation, live action. I wanted to get Wobble in it, doing all the William Blake stuff. So, and he was up for that. I even got him trying out some pixelation himself. Not so good. So, but all the other stuff worked out pretty well. And so it was all done on Super 8, on 16 millimeter. And so I ended up transferring it all onto video, editing it together. And I remember going up to London and seeing him in his house in London and showing it to him for the first time, and he was just knocked out. I looked at some of the Wobble videos before that, and you wouldn't even know who Jar Wobble was because he was never really sort of presented in them. And this time he was really kind of featured in his own video, and he really loved it. He absolutely loved it. I don't know how we did it for the 3,000. Well, I do know how we did it for the 3,000 because we managed to get some free post-production, like the color grading in London. Managed to get that for free. Managed to get an editing facility for free, and that was the only way of doing it. And a lot of that stuff went on at that time. You know, all of the independent films, music videos. You were always you had to beg, borrow, and steal just to be able to get the thing made. Otherwise, it'd never happen. So there was a lot of goodwill around at that time. So it was amazing, really, what it was possible to do. So in between the features, I would sort of get back into those independent projects, which were usually a lot of fun, and not only were they were fun, but you had an amazing amount of freedom. Like Wobble said, there you go, make me a film. That was it. I could do almost just whatever I wanted for him. And luckily he loved it, so that was great. So a lot of that went on. And then another opportunity sort of came up where I was asked to go to sort of Marseille and direct a movie. This was a CG movie. It was based on I suppose it was the TV program. It was French originally. It was called The Magic Roundabout. And the film was called The Magic Roundabout. And I ended up going down to sort of Marseille and sort of directing. And it was great being in sort of Marseille, working with a sort of French crew. I mean, I'm not in love with sort of CGI, but that was the first of a couple of CGI films that I ended up working on. So there was The Magic Roundabout, which had another name that when it came out in the States, I can't remember what that was. I think it was called Dougal. And it was about, what would it have been, 2003. And so there was still the deal. There was a deal with Aardman and DreamWorks, and we were going to be making a film based on this aristocratic rat called sort of Roddy the Rat, who lived in Kensington. And it was this film called Flushed Away, and it was going to be a stop-frame animation film. But Peter Lord went on holiday for a couple of weeks, and Jeffrey Katzenberg decided, it's going to be a CGI film, and we're going to make it in Glendale. So it ended, all of a sudden, being CGI. I started to be a consultant on it. I spent a lot of time on sort of phone calls, between sort of Bristol and Glendale about, the look of the film. And then it came to the point where they said, you should come over here to Glendale. And so I ended up sort of going out to Glendale 3 months at a time. And they said, can you come back for another 3 months? And can you come back for another 3 months? And, I was having to lie my way, coming in past the customs and saying, I'm not really working here. I'm not, because it wasn't a proper working visa. So I had to lie my ass off every time, I came back to DreamWorks. So eventually I had to say to them, look, guys, if you want me out here, you're going to have to give me a proper visa. So in the end, they got me a proper visa. So I ended up sort of working on sort of Flushed Away, which was sort of CGI, and I was really their head of layout. And they were a little bit worried about me because and Jeffrey Katzenberg likes his films to be really bright, and he was worried that Aardman's film looked a bit dark to him, like Chicken Run was kind of too dark, and so he didn't really want anything that was going to look like that. So they were sort of kind of keeping me away from the lighting a bit, because they thought that I would make Flushed Away too dark. But come on, it was a subterranean world most of the time. I think it should have been a bit dark anyway. But so working on that film, it was a film pretty much directed by committee. It was I thought originally it had a great story. You had this aristocratic rat. He was looked after by his two butlers, which were these two hamsters, and they were a great comedy element in the film. But they thought, or the committee thought, oh, Roddy needs to be, more lonely. Let's get rid of the hamsters. They'd animated, they'd lit, they'd spent, millions of dollars, on these brilliant hamsters, and they decided to dump them. So then they dumped a huge comedy part of the film. They were the reason I thought that Roddy needed to get back to his apartment at the end of Flushed Away. And I thought, well, he doesn't really have a reason anymore. So that kind of wrecked that. So I didn't think it was a great idea. And it was at one of their committee meetings. It was in a conference room. And they always go around and they ask everyone what you think. And so I thought I told them what I thought. And I said, well, the script was better a few months ago when you had the hamsters in the show. They didn't like that, and I wasn't invited back to any of those meetings, which I was good with. That was fine. So anyway, I don't know, CGI, it's all right, but it wasn't stop frame animation. And it was while I was working on the grade for sort of Flushed Away, I was asked about whether I had time to sort of go up to Oregon and to go to Portland to talk to a DOP up there who was going to be making a film called Coraline. So I said, yeah, I can sort of fly up and see you. So I took some sort of time out and I sort of flew up to Oregon, and I met the guys who were putting the Coraline feature together, which is based on a story by Neil Gaiman. I'd read the book and thought it was absolutely fantastic. So I thought, this is one project I absolutely want to be involved in. And I remember at the time there was a production manager that I knew, and so I'd been to the studio, sort of met the DP there. I was going to go as a sort of lighting sort of camera, and I thought the studio space was great. It was this studio space out in Hillsborough. And I thought, this looks like it's going to be a really good project to work on. So that evening, on the day I was there, I was going to be meeting the production manager and the DP. And the production manager said, oh, if you go back in town, you can meet up with some friends of mine, and they'll kind of take you to one of the nice sort of breweries, and we'll meet up with you and we'll go for a meal later. So I met up with his friends in town, and I was having a few drinks. I had a couple of drinks. I was in a really good mood when the DP and the production manager arrived. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't falling about or anything. But I was really happy because I was really happy about the day. I thought everything had been going really well. But what happened is when they walked away that evening, the DP said to the production manager, has Frank got a problem with drink? And Harry said, oh, no, he's been down in LA working at DreamWorks, he's just letting his hair down. But that was a good enough reason for him not to take me on. So for a few months, I didn't have a job on sort of Coraline, and still it started to go out of control. The film was going on a lot longer than it should. And so Harry, the production manager, said to the DP, he said, now you've really got to get Frank involved, because, he's someone that you can rely on to sort of pull things together quickly. And so they got back to me, and they brought me over to work on Coraline. So for the last year of Coraline, that was a really great experience. By that time, because Chicken Run had been film, everything that I worked on was on film, apart from the CGI projects. I think The Curse of the Were-Rabbit was the last film project, or the last feature that Aardman did. And then after that, everything went digital. So this was the first digital feature that I worked on. Stop frame animation is working with puppets and sets in real space. And it's really slow. It's glacial, the rate of sort of animation. So the only way to achieve a feature like that is to have multiple units. So you have to have a studio that's full of multiple units draped off with black curtains. And then behind those curtains, you're going to have a lighting setup, you'll have the set, and then you'll have all the puppets that are going to inhabit that set. And you have to have, one animator, for each of those units. And that's the only way to sort of, get it done. What was then, they were trying to make these features in about 18 months. And then the other thing with using sort of puppets, the puppets are either their joints, the metal skeletons that enable you to animate them. They can get loose, or sometimes the silicon that they're made out of can get torn. So they have to go back to the puppet hospital. Then they have to come back out onto the set. So it's a very long sort of process. And the only way to do it is to have as many units as you can sort of cram into a studio space. And on nearly every stop frame animation feature that I've worked on, and the current one, for instance, they said, well, we're going to have 17 animators and we're going to have 34 units. So those 17 animators, they're always going to have a bounce unit that they can jump into that's already pre-lit and is already going to have the puppets and everything ready for them to go straight into. Never, ever works out that way. Never, ever. So now I'm already up to about 52 units. My animators have gone from 17 to 39. And that has happened on nearly every stop frame sort of feature that I've worked on. Adding units to get the movie done in time. So I always order a few extra cameras. The producer's saying, why do you need all these cameras? Well, that's the number of cameras we're going to need at the end of this project, even though we haven't got there yet. And they say, well, you can't have that many cameras. And I said, okay, well, we will eventually. And so you scale it down, you get so many cameras. And then, but, by the end, and it's already happening on the film I'm currently on. Those number of cameras is escalated, the number of units is escalated, and the number of animators is escalated. So everything's going faster in terms of servicing all these units, but the animation, there's only one speed that can be done at. And that's just the nature of stop frame animation. I mean, beautiful medium, but can be painful. I think, well, for me, stop frame animation has become, I think it's the medium that I'm most happy working in now. And I think it is one of the most creative. So on the one hand, it's got all the attributes of working in live action because you've got a real set. And your actor, although your actor is only 9 inches high or 10 inches high, and it's just going to take a lot, the scene that would be filmed in less than an hour in live action is possibly going to take you 3 weeks in a stop frame animation. The way there are a number of things that work in your favor in terms of the creativity, because you've got so much more control on the way you light something. Because you're working frame by frame, you can put in different lighting scenarios that you can decide how to use later. So, for instance, you're shooting a scene and you might want, let's take something very basic. You might want an alarm light coming on, but you don't know, is it going to fade up over 10 frames? And am I going to hold it for 10? But because the way you use it in post, you can just put on a light that is on a separate exposure, and then you manipulate that in the post-production, something that you could never be able to do in live action, for instance. And it's by taking the frames, one at a time, that enables you to do much more in the post process, so that you can manipulate that image in far more ways than you could on a live action set. So, it's one of the things I really like about it. And the director I'm working with at the moment, who's mainly been working in live action for years and years and years, it's something that he realizes, oh, wow, we can do this. This is great. And it's one of the nice things about sort of stop frame animation, I guess. After I worked on Coraline, they did invite me back. They asked me if I would like to be the director of photography on the next feature that Leica was doing, which was Paranorman. And so I come back to sort of Leica, and I met the director on that feature and the producer, and I thought, oh, this is a great story. I'd love to do this. So I said yes, but I said, have you got a green light? And he said, no, we don't have a green light yet. And so what happened is during that time, I'd gone back to the UK, and then Aardmans were getting together to shoot a film called The Pirates. And they'd asked me if I would be DOP on that. And in this, in the stop frame animation world, there's not that many projects around. You can't ever turn anything down. So I had to accept that. So I had to let Paranorman go, which eventually did get a green light. And then they asked me back if I could do the box trolls, but I wasn't able to do the box trolls either. And it wasn't until they were developing a new feature on a Japanese theme called Kubo and the Two Strings. And they asked me again, whether I would like to sort of come back and shoot Kubo. And I was available. So I said I'd love to do that, because there's nothing more that I like. I mean, I love Kurosawa movies. I love so many Japanese movies. Anything with Japanese theme in it. It's got magic in it. It's got samurais. I am in. Please let me do it. So I got on really well with the guy who'd written it and who created it and was going to be directing it, Shannon Tyndall. And so I came, back to sort of Portland and started working on Kubo and the Two Strings, which was a really great project. Absolutely loved doing it. It's a shame that we didn't stay with the original director. Travis Knight decided that he wanted to direct the film. And so, unfortunately, they gave the elbow to Shannon Tyndall, and Travis took over. I think it was still a good movie, but I believe if the original director had stayed with the project, it would have been a better movie than the one we ended up with. But it was great to be sort of, working, back at Leica. One of the good things that working with Leica is all the amazing toys that you've got. The Moco unit there is absolutely fantastic. So any kind of motion control that you want to do, it's there. I do a lot with motion control, and it's not just moving the camera. I do a lot because I believe that light is just moving all the time. So I like to use the motion control for moving clouds in front of the lights. So I like the shots sometimes when there's outside to be able to see, sometimes it might be subtle, but it's to give the scene a very airy feel so that you can feel that movement of light, even if you don't exactly see it. Sometimes if I really want to amp up the drama, I'll really sort of put on some heavier sort of clouds. And so I build frames, that are 10 feet by 5 feet, and I will track them in front of a 10K light so that I've got this, really, really cool dramatic movement of light in the frame. So I do that quite a bit. and also use it for moving, reflections off water and stuff like that. So I like to move the light and manipulate the light as much as possible. Whenever I get to a new project, so you start with a script, and then you have the animatic. And I think it's really important with any shot. I really like to listen to the dialogue. Who's talking? What are they saying? What is the focus of the shot? I really want to know the focus of every single shot, because that's going to have an effect on the way I approach lighting it, framing it, putting a camera move onto it. I think it's really vitally important to sort of know that and to really know the script inside out. And then, from shot to shot, from sequence to sequence, they've all got, a certain, an emotional heft that needs to be there. And you can do so much with light and with color and with the framing and with the camera movement to really emphasize whatever emotional impact you want from that particular shot or from that particular sequence. Yeah, so after Cuba and the Two Strings, I went back to the UK. I still had my apartment in sort of Portland, so I thought I'd keep it on. And I went back to work on it's a Christmas commercial. They do these commercials in the UK, like some of the top supermarkets, like Sainsbury's, like Tesco's, like John Lewis. They're almost like short films. They're like 4.5 minutes. They can only ever afford to show them once or twice at Christmas. But it's almost like a competition between the top supermarkets who can sort of put out the commercial with the most impact. And so this year, it was a Sainsbury's ad, but it was an opportunity to make something really good and to do something just in 6 weeks. So I worked in a studio in London. There was sort of great sort of characters, great sets, and something like that comes together really quickly is really great to do something like that. Just a one-off sort of project. And then when you're in London, or a lot of the times I've been in London and I've been approached by other companies to do some either lighting camera work or to DOP another feature. And I was asked to work on a couple of other projects. So one of the things I joined in the very early stages, they would Netflix got together with another company in London to do a new version of Watership Down, and it was I remember loving the first Watership Down movie, which was really quite, it was quite hard hitting. It was, quite a few adult themes in it. I stayed up in London and I was working on, it was the layout for Watership Down, which was fun for a while. And then I would have stayed with the project, but they decided that they were going to move the project to Mumbai. And I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go out to Mumbai and sort of work over there. And at that time, I had another offer from Leica just to go back and work as a lighting camera on their next stop frame animation. And so I thought, yeah, there'll be absolutely no pressure to do that. So I decided to go back to Leica, worked on Missing Link for a while, had a great crew that I was working with there. So I enjoyed that. And then at the end of that, I was invited to sort of come for an interview back at Aardman for Chicken Run 2. And I read the script, quite liked it. So I went over to Artman's, went for the interview. They offered me the job. So I came back over to Portland, sent my classic Mustang back to Bristol, was packing all the stuff up in my apartment. And then I got a phone call. And it was from Mark Gustafson, who was going to be co-director on a new, a completely fresh look at the story of Pinocchio. And it was going to be directed by Mark and by Guillermo del Toro. And when they told me this, I thought, wow, because I've been hearing about this project for the last 10 years. And it was going to be filmed in Barcelona. It was going to be in LA. It was going to be in Manchester. It was going to be in London. And then they told me, well, we're going to set up a studio in Slab Town, which is like 10 minutes from my apartment, which has never happened to me. I've always got to travel at least half an hour or an hour to nearly every studio that I've worked in. So I thought, this is a great opportunity, but I knew that Guillermo is very sort of particular about his colors, about his lighting. I said, look, I'm going to have to meet Guillermo del Toro first, because otherwise, it's not a done deal. So they flew me down to Los Angeles, and I met up with Guillermo in the Netflix building. And that was a great meeting. I went into the conference room, sat down opposite him, and he said, well, tell me a little bit about your process. So I said, well, one of the first things I like to get involved in is the color script. And when I said that, he leaned across the table towards me and said, not if I beat you to it. So I said, all right, fine. I know how particularly you are about your colors. But I said, as part of the process, I really like to get involved with it. He said, absolutely, absolutely. And I look forward to collaborating with you on it. And anyway, the whole session went really well. I got on with him really well. He's an amazing guy, a brilliant guy, but a really, really nice person, and very mischievous, very funny. But I thought this is great, and so I that's what I'm doing currently, is sort of working on Pinocchio, which is one of the best projects that I've worked on. Is probably the best script. It really is something else. Of course, I can't tell you anything about that. Well, I guess the film industry was always something that I thought other people did that I would never be involved in. And I loved the movies, and I suppose it was that whole magic thing about movies. Because it was sort of magic, it was another world. And it was never a world that I ever imagined being a part of. But once I realized there was a way in, and once I realized what kind of world that was, what could be achieved in that world in terms of the kind of creativity that you could bring to it. And I think it's all the facets of your life, everything that you've done in your life, all of your experiences, everything that I did, like when I was at art school, when I was hitchhiking, around the States, when I was experiencing all these different sort of cultures, meeting all these different people, there was none of it that didn't have some bearing on what was going to come out of me in the future in terms of how creative I could be as a cinematographer, as a filmmaker. I have no regrets in that way. I'm probably one of the downsides to it is, like, if you want to hold down a relationship, not so good if one year you're gonna be in Marseille, the next year you might be in Los Angeles, the next year after that you might be in Oregon or somewhere else. So, but In terms of what you can get out of being a part of this great industry, the amazing people that work in it, it's something that I have absolutely no regrets about. And there's a way in for anybody who has got that spark of creativity, and has just got a will to, create something beautiful, create something meaningful that other people can be affected by in a really special way.